Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nolwazi Mbongwa, and I'll be presenting a study that has been published in the South African Journal of Botany titled Medicinal Plant Cultivation, Beliefs and Perceptions of Traditional Healers and Multi-Traders in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. According to Williams et al. 2013, more than 2,000 medicinal plant species are documented as being used and or traded in South Africa, most of which are harvested from the wild on communal or private land. For some critics of the medicinal plant trade, much of which is without the requisite permits and thus illegal, demand reduction and better law enforcement are touted as essential means to reduce the pressures on declining wild populations. However, law enforcement has been finding it difficult to curb the decline in wild populations, and this might be partly due to the interconnected web of medicinal plant trade. This figure is showing us the different stakeholders that play a role in the demand and supply of wildlife. So we have harvesters. Those harvesters are the ones that directly harvest the medicinal plants from the wild, and they either sell it directly to the traditional healer or they sell it to an intermediary. That intermediary will also either sell it directly to a traditional healer or they will sell it to a multi-trader or a multi-shop trader or multi-market trader. That multi-market trader will either also sell to a traditional healer directly or will sell to the cultural and medicinal patient. So a cultural patient is someone that requires a particular medicinal plant, not necessarily for any physical illness or disease, but rather for rituals and other cultural entities. The traditional healers, however, are also able to directly harvest the materials for themselves, and at the same time, they are also able to directly give those particular medicinal plants to the medicinal patient and the cultural patient. As much as there is a huge decline in wild medicinal plants, for stakeholders such as traditional healers and harvesters, however, seasoned consumptive use is contrary to traditional mores. Cultivation is one of the methods currently used to mitigate the decline, but it has not commercialized. This is partly due to the gaps in knowledge about the socio-cultural norms associated with using cultivated medicinal plants by traditional healers and traders. Therefore, this study aimed to scrutinize medicinal plant cultivation in the context of plants that are considered acceptable and unacceptable to cultivate, plants perceived to be declining in availability, and whether there is a relationship between plants that are considered acceptable to cultivate and those that are declining in availability. The main survey was carried out over 7 months from August 2016 to March 2017 with 114 participants, of which 72 multi-traders were from urban and rural markets of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, and 42 traditional healers were from urban and rural study sites of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. Now I will take you to the results and discussions. This table is looking at the comparison between the acceptability and limitations of cultivated medicinal plants by healers and traders. So what we wanted to understand is that, are our healers and traders already cultivating? And if they are not, what is dissuading them from doing so? So 64% of healers and traders said they do not cultivate. Of that 64% of the healers, 55% said that it's because of lack of water, as most of them said that they do have space in the villages, however they do not have access to water. And this is of no surprise because we know that South Africa is a water-scarce country. And of the 64% of the traders that said that they do not cultivate, 54% of those traders said that lack of time is what is dissuading them from actually cultivating. Most of the traders are actually part of the medicinal plant trade to alleviate poverty. So trading is actually a business practice for them. So they felt that if they are taking care of propagated material, it will take a lot of time from the time that they should be spending in their shops or stalls selling to customers. And 36% of healers and traders actually said that they do grow medicinal plants in their home gardens. And when we asked the 36% of healers and traders, where do they get the propagation material from? Majority of them, 67% and 81% of healers and traders respectively, said they're getting it from the wild. This is promising, but at the same time it's worrying because if there's a particular plant that is already locally extinct in the area, it means that particular plant will not be cultivated by that particular respondent. And when we ask them, do the respondents believe that cultivation is truly a solution to declining wild population? Majority of healers and traders, 74% and 83% respectively, said that they do not believe so. However, when we spoke about them further, they said that it's not that they don't want to cultivate, but the reasons that they've already mentioned, like lack of water, lack of space, and lack of time, is one thing that is making them to be demotivated from cultivating. And then when we further probe them and ask them, what do they think should be done, or what cultivation scheme should be used in order to mass propagate? They felt that 58% of healers and traders respectively felt that the farmers are at a better position to be able to commercialize the cultivation of medicinal plants because they already have access to resources as they are already farming other crops. This following graph is showing us the selected ethnospecies that receive citations for being both allowed and should not allowed to be cultivated. So I asked my respondents to list me a species that is allowed to be cultivated and those that should not be cultivated. So when I was doing my data analysis, I was able to see that there are particular species whereby one respondent said it's allowed and then the other said should not be allowed. This is an indication that not all user groups share the same beliefs, and what determines the cultural acceptability of the species for cultivation is embedded in sacred traditions that knowledge holders are sometimes typically not at liberty to reveal. And also, there are worldviews and belief systems that the will of the ancestors can prohibit certain plants from being grown and/or plants that have spiritual characteristics that might hinder cultivation. Also, there are some signs that physiological barriers to successful propagation cultivation might sometimes be correlated with species that one should not cultivate. For example, some of the spiritual limitations of plants is that there are plants that people believe that if you were to cultivate it near homesteads, it will bring about lightning, death, or unrest in the family and the community as a whole. However, there was a particular plant, Encephalitis species, that was mentioned the most as should not be cultivated. Encephalitis species should not be cultivated might have been inadvertently a reason from generational observations that it is naturally difficult to cultivate, which in turn could have been interpreted as a sign from the ancestors that one cannot cultivate them. The following figure is showing us the comparison between plants cited as decreasing in availability and plants that are allowed to be cultivated. There was a weak correlation between the frequencies of plants cited as decreasing with the frequencies of being allowed to be cultivated, as most of the plants that are listed here were of least concern on the South African red list, except obviously for Wabega salutaris, Ocotea bullata, and Encephalitis species, and the others. This is suggesting to us that the participants' basis for cultural plant selection was independent of their perceived availability in the wild. The result of some of the species, however, raises a question as to whether traditional knowledge and observations on how plants perform in the wild, including their regeneration responses to destructive harvesting, influences whether they are determined to be culturally acceptable to cultivate or not. And this goes back to that figure that I showed at the beginning, that there are a lot of players in medicinal plant trade. So some of our respondents might have not been harvesting for themselves, so they do not have a clear picture of the wild populations. Instead, they have gatherers that are selling them particular medicinal plants, for example, Wabega salutaris, and they are thinking that most probably still available in the wild, only to find that that particular medicinal plant has been sourced from a neighboring country. However, some of the respondents said that they are able to see that a particular plant is not available in the wild anymore by it being more expensive in comparison to other species. The next graph is showing us the comparisons of the likelihood that healers and traders would purchase cultivated sources of the medicinal plants they named as allowed to be cultivated if they were available. So what we wanted to know from our respondents is, if ever we were to make cultivated material available to you, would you buy it? So the majority of the respondents, both healers and traders, said they're very likely to actually buy cultivated medicinal plants. However, there were more traders than healers that said they are very likely to buy. This is of no surprise because traders need to stock to sell. So they need a regular supply. Therefore, traders are more likely to buy plants from sources that are available to them. And for traditional healers, sometimes the ancestors are the ones that guide them and give them direction as to where they should harvest. And also, even if they are to buy a medicinal plant, sometimes the source of that medicinal plant should be known so that they can be able to carry out their practices in a respectful manner to the ancestors. The results shed some light on the perceptions of scarcity, availability, and some of the socio-cultural complexities pertaining to cultivation of medicinal plants as a conservation strategy. Plant species decreasing in availability are not necessarily cultivation priorities because of differences in knowledge, perceptions, beliefs, and professions of different user groups. Recognizing what plants can or should not be cultivated will potentially minimize conflicts of interest between resource users and conservation authorities and bridges the divide between science and tradition, thereby enabling some consensus on priority species for cultivation by stakeholder groups, and thus potentially curtail superfluous expenditure in community cultivation schemes that do not fully satisfy the requirements of the beneficiaries. Furthermore, respecting socio-cultural norms and practices is essential to African communities, as most of their worldviews are centered on the existence of ancestors. Even though times have changed, cultural norms and ancestral guidance is still essential to both traditional healers and traders. And culturally appropriate conservation interventions should accommodate these beliefs. Siyathokoza, thank you.